SSA, and welcome to yet another edition of our Yellow Couch Conversations or podcasts. And today is a very special podcast because it's around a topic that's really close to my own heart. And today we're gonna talk about GBV, and the entire purpose of today is to bring to the fore what we're sitting with today in society around GBV. And I hope that at the end of this podcast, we would have inspired many of you to start talking about this topic openly and help us address one of the real ills in society today. But as you've become accustomed by now, I'm not on my own, and I have the wonderful opportunity to welcome a very special guest with me today. Dakalo, welcome to the Yellow Couch Conversation. Please introduce yourself to our SSA viewers.
My name is Dakalo Singo. I am by profession, I'm an attorney. I'm a director at Worksman's Attorneys, and I head up the pro bono department there. And as part of my work, I deal with many aspects of domestic violence, but for today's discussion, that includes representing individuals affected by domestic violence and gender-based violence in the domestic violence court. Over and above that, I assist and represent organizations from civil society in making submissions to advance their advocacy regarding what laws should be implemented and how they should be implemented regarding gender-based violence and femicide.
Dakalo, thank you, and once again, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
The statistics are staggering. They're just simply staggering. Every 10 minutes, a woman is killed. 60% of female homicides were committed by partners or family members. Why is it that we're sitting with this incredible ill in society today? How is it that you and I sit here today talking about this conversation as two men?
Look, it's a difficult question to answer, an important question, but it's difficult to answer for maybe two reasons. The first reason is that the answer you get will depend on who you're speaking to. I'm an attorney, but if you're speaking to a sociologist, if you're speaking to an academic, an economist, you'll get different versions of why this is such a prevalent thing. Speaking for myself as a lawyer, of course, the reality is that there are many factors, a multitude of factors that influence why it's such a big and controversial issue and why it's so prevalent in society. The first thing is, of course, that there's generally gender inequality in our society, coupled with things such as toxic masculinity and patriarchal norms that allow people to abuse women, or men in particular to abuse women. And because of these societal structures, these norms and patriarchal ways of thinking that have been perpetuated over generations, there's essentially what we call a generational cycle of violence, which continues to be perpetuated with each new generation of people. When, for example, a young child witnesses his or her mother being abused by the father, the impact of that is to create a situation where it is normalized, and the violence that they see, they will replicate at a later stage, whether it's against another adult person when they become an adult, or whether it's against another child. It doesn't matter, but ultimately that cycle of violence is created and is perpetuated throughout society because of things such as, like I said, toxic masculinity and the likes. So as a lawyer as well, what I will add is that we have a situation where there are laws that exist to deal with these things, right? But the perpetuation of GBV in society is made worse by the fact that even though these laws exist, they are not properly enforced or implemented. And as a result, people become despondent by, for example, not reporting cases of gender-based violence to the police when they should. And even those who do report end up feeling like justice will never be served because these cases take so long. Some of these perpetrators, even though they are arrested and released on bail, are never actually found guilty of the crimes they've been charged with. And that obviously creates, like I said, despondency in people reporting further cases to the police. So yeah, as a lawyer, that's the that's the answer I can give. But like I said, uh, in a general sense, it will depend on who you're speaking to and their views and inclinations.
There's a lot to unpack here. And I think for me, the first thing that I'd like us to unpack a little bit is that many people think of it as physical violence only. But clearly there's a lot more to it, such as emotional, psychological, and economic abuse, and the impact that has on the victims. Help us unpack that a little bit. What does that look like?
I mean, when people think about gender-based violence or domestic violence, they generally think of physical violence. You're absolutely right on that aspect. But the reality is there are many different types of abuse, of domestic violence, of gender-based violence. You've mentioned some of them. So, for example, a very common type of abuse is the economic abuse. But before I get into that, another type of abuse which you mentioned, which will inform what economic abuse is psychological, verbal, and emotional abuse. So, with that type of abuse, for example, it's non-physical, right? It involves things such as the name sort of suggests, um, where you insult someone, where you humiliate them with your words, where you name calling, where you try and manipulate someone psychologically, where you berate them and the likes. The aim of that sort of abuse, where a perpetrator, emotionally abuses, psychologically abuses someone, the aim is ultimately to gain a sense of control over that person. And that in itself is a different type of abuse, coercive control. In the Domestic Violence Act, it's called controlling behavior and coercive behavior. They are two separate things, but ultimately they fall under the umbrella of coercive control, which is a perpetrator's intention of subjecting someone to their power and control, domineering them and making them submissive to the perpetrator's will. So that's the psychological, verbal, and emotional abuse. Now, with economic abuse, also a non-physical type of abuse, the aim remains the same. It's a way in which a perpetrator tries to control, well, specifically in this case, the finances of another person, their partner, usually, in order again to subject them to their power and control. And there are two ways that happens. One is that um, the perpetrator might, for example, directly control the finances of the other person. So
Right.
the partner earns a salary, and then this person, is control of the banking app and the banking card, where that salary is received, such that the person who's earning the salary has no access to it. So they lose their power to control their own finances. Another way, of course, is if the perpetrator happens to be the breadwinner, they make none of the finances and funds available to that other person, such that this the I guess the target becomes dependent on the person's
Almost
finances.
submissive.
Exactly, and again, it comes down to the aspect I mentioned earlier that you know, especially with psychological abuse, it's all about power and control, domineering the person such that they can't live essentially without you. Over and above that, there are other types of abuse. The amendments in the past few years have introduced things such as spiritual abuse, where you exploit someone's religious beliefs, for example. They are um, I've already mentioned the coercive and controlling behaviors. There are other things such as I guess what's called third party abuse, where the perpetrator abuses, say, a friend or relative of yours in order to, again, to control you and how you act around them. So, yeah, the general thinking and the general, I guess, um, public will know more about physical violence than other types of domestic abuse. But there are a variety of domestic abuses out there.
Dakalo, what are some of the early warning signs that people may overlook in relationships or interactions? What can you highlight a couple of those early warning signs or early red flags if you want?
They start off small. I mean, the red flags usually take a long time to identify because they're so small, they're so subtle, and you will only understand that there were red flags months down the line, years down the line, when you have been in the relationship usually for a long time, and the perpetrator has sort of clawed their way into manipulating how you think about things. So, what are some of these red flags? I mean, the obvious one, again, going back to the very root of what domestic violence is excessive controlling of someone's behavior, excessive controlling of someone's life. Um, Coupled with that is um, isolating an individual from any support systems, such as family, friends, colleagues, even. So the perpetrator will, for example, want to you know monopolize your time. So instead of you going out with friends, going out to to dinner with relatives, visiting your family, even they want you to spend all of your time with them, and that is purely to again manipulate your psychology into depending on them, so that you are submissive, you are under their control, and they have absolute power over you. So what that looks like in reality is very different depending on who you're dealing with, but it's not something you might necessarily identify right at the beginning.
At that point in
At
time.
that point in time, it takes time to develop a pattern, and once that pattern is developed, it's usually too late for you to to remove yourself from that situation easily. But yeah, so there's excessive control, isolating you from sources of support. Oftentimes, depending, of course, on someone's financial circumstances, the start of a relationship is usually, they say honeymoon phase. It's usually a very pleasant and blissful time. Your partner might, for example, and I think the word that is often used is love bombing. They might shower you with excessive affection, with gifts, with praise, telling you how beautiful you are and the like. But that is usually normal at the start of a relationship for many people, right? But the difference with love bombing is that it happens with, um, I guess, the perpetrator's intention to control you, again, as I've said before, and manipulate you into depending on them. Um, so they'll shower you with these affections and gifts and so on, with a view to making sure that down the line, when you are now comfortable with how things are in the relationship, they'll be able to manipulate you into doing whatever they would like you to do, however they would like to control you and manipulate you essentially. So yeah, those are some red flags, and again, it differs from relationship to relationship, but the main thing is that the perpetrator is always trying to find a way to manipulate you, and the aim of doing so is to control you at the end of the day.
Well, thank you. So with that in mind, what are some of the ways that we as society can start dismantling the stigma around victims of abuse? How do we go about it?
It's it's difficult, again, because as I said earlier, the factors that contribute to gender-based violence being so prevalent are so multifaceted. So you will have people suggesting things from an economic perspective, from a social perspective, from a cultural perspective. But the main thing is ultimately to challenge the societal norms that allow this to exist. So challenging patriarchal standards that allow for gender inequality is one way to do things, and of course. Um, an important aspect is educating people, raising awareness as you're doing now, to make people aware of the fact that certain conduct constitutes domestic violence, constitutes gender based violence, and allowing them to, to become aware that they are being manipulated, they're being controlled, they are being subjected to different forms of abuse. I mean, if you don't know that there is such a thing as spiritual abuse, how are you going to act on it, for example? So the starting point is to raise awareness about these things, educate people so that they're in a position to identify when they are being subjected to domestic violence or gender based violence. when a friend or a colleague is undergoing gender-based violence or domestic violence as well, um, because then you'll be able to action and deal with the I guess the things that contribute to allowing the violence to I guess happen in that situation.
An unfair question, so feel free not to answer it.
Sure.
But I can't help but wonder, if you get to where you and I are sitting today having this conversation, isn't that too late? Shouldn't this be something that's part of our school curriculum?
That would be a useful approach. It goes back to what I've just said about educating people,
Yeah.
and school is a very ideal place to have that done. Obviously, I don't know that it's ever too late to educate someone, whether they're at school or in an employment context. Education is of course important, and you I mean, in the employment context, for example, they will have missed the ship to be educated in the context of a primary or high school. But by having discussions around gender-based violence in a real-world setting, uh, in our context as adults, we are able to I guess bring that understanding to everyone, whether they whether they had the luxury of the education that they should be having at at the I guess at a primary and high school level or not. So ultimately, yeah, I think it may seem too late, but it's not, because as long as people are made aware of the fact that they do have rights, and in order to access those rights, they need to have an understanding of what they're dealing with. It I can't say it's a waste. Um, it's a wasted opportunity to allow people to learn. So it's not too late in my view.
And nor can it ever be too early, I
That
guess.
too. That too.
Nor could it ever be too early. Now, we often hear people ask the question, why don't you just leave your abusive partner? But you'll understand the complexities probably better than most. Can you talk us through some of those complexities, maybe?
Sure. Look, I've acted for many people who have been subjected to domestic violence and gender-based violence, and I've, like you said, developed an understanding of why it's difficult for them to leave. I'm not professing to be an expert or anything, but in my experience, the nature of the perpetrator's control and manipulations over an extended period of time have made it so difficult for, I guess, the survivor to leave the relationship. And part of the reason is that they, for some people, it's something as basic as they don't know that what is happening to them is actually domestic violence. And again, this is why platforms like this talking about gender-based and domestic violence is important to raise awareness. But beyond that, the psychological manipulations of the perpetrator will make it so that the survivor is completely ensconced in the relationship and cannot leave it because of the psychological manipulation they've been subjected to over a very long period of time. I remember reading a study where domestic violence, the psychological manipulation that happens in domestic violence, was compared to the systems that some countries use to torture prisoners in jail, and it's very different scenarios, but the thinking is the same. By manipulating someone psychologically, by subjecting them to different psychological tactics over a long period of time, they will eventually break. And I think it puts them in a position where they feel they can't leave a relationship. Over and above that, there's of course just economic vulnerability of women in a general sense. If, for example, economic abuse is at play, it becomes difficult for someone to leave that relationship for financial reasons. They will simply have nowhere to go. So if they decide, I'm leaving my partner, I'm leaving this place, my house, my home, my flat, whatever, they simply have nowhere to go, because at that point they will have been isolated so much from sources of support that they just feel like there's nowhere that they can go if they decide to leave. And I guess that's what makes that long-term psychological manipulation so effective. Um, in addition, of course, to the finances that people may sometimes use to manipulate their partners. So yeah, it's a very difficult animal to deal with because the perpetrator's aim is to keep you in this relationship, to depend on them, using the tactics we've discussed. The psychological abuse, the love bombing, and all the rest of it.
Would you say it's more pronounced in countries with high unemployment?
It it is. I mean, South Africa is unfortunately a country with high levels of gender-based violence. I mean, we are often referred to as the rape capital of the world. And um, I guess another form of physical violence includes sexual harassment, sexual abuse, and that is especially prevalent in this country. Um,
What a terrible title to have.
it is
What a
a
terrible
terrible
title to
title
have.
to have indeed. And this is why, of course, you hear civil society organizations looking to challenge government on the policies they've put in place to deal with these things. And yeah, it's difficult to deal with because it's such a widespread and prevalent thing. And yeah, ultimately, government has a responsibility to protect people. The Constitution directly says you must ensure freedom of personal security. You must ensure that each person in this country has the protection of the state and the police, and that they are generally safe in the community.
That's a great segue into my next question, because from a legal standpoint, what rights and protections exists for victims of gender-based violence?
It depends on the nature of the of the violence they suffer. There are two main avenues that one can follow. The first is if the violence they've been subjected to, physical, sexual, whatever it might be, actually constitutes a crime, they must report it to the police. But it's hard to say, for example, that economic abuse constitutes a crime, right? So the first avenue available to people is if um, the domestic violence or gender-based violence they've been subjected to constitutes a crime, they report that, they go to the police and report that as a crime. The second avenue is applicable, I guess, whether or not it is a crime, what's happened to you. So whether it's sexual or physical violence, whether it's economic abuse or spiritual abuse, what you do there is you approach the domestic violence court. Um, and even though it is called the domestic violence court, it doesn't just deal with people in domestic relationships. It deals, because there's the Domestic Violence Act and there's the Protection from Harassment Act, which are the two pieces of legislation, I guess, that govern what you can do in circumstances. So if, for example, a stranger is stalking you, you would still approach the domestic violence court, even though there's technically not a domestic relationship between you and them. So the domestic violence court exists to allow people to approach them with a view to getting protection orders, which will essentially protect you or are supposed to protect you from the perpetrator committing further acts of domestic violence. So, naturally, of course, that presupposes and starts with an act of domestic violence must have occurred. Whatever type it is, doesn't really matter as long as it appears in the legislation. But an act must have occurred to sort of trigger you approaching the domestic violence court, after which you then apply for a protection order. Um, the effect of the protection order is that if the person commits another act of domestic violence against you, they will immediately be arrested for contravening that protection order. And yeah, those are the two main ways in which a person can seek to protect themselves against domestic violence.
Building on what's existing at the moment, are there any legal reforms or public initiatives that you're aware of that gives you hope that we're making progress?
I hate to sound like a pessimist, but as I've already said, part of the problem is that there are laws in place, but they're not being enforced or enforced properly. Um, there was, for example, the march that happened in 2018. the result of which was that a group of civil society organizations and individuals marched and met with ultimately the president, Cyril Ramaphosa, and handed a memo of demands, a memorandum of demands that they wanted met. They stipulated things such as changing the laws, and introducing policies to better accommodate people who've been subjected to gender-based violence. As a result of that, a process started where there was a national summit on gender-based violence. I don't remember exactly when that was. I think it was shortly after 2018, so 2019 maybe. And following that summit, there were amendments made to the law. For example, the Domestic Violence Act was amended to introduce all these additional types of abuse which were never covered before. The amendments included additional things. So they introduced what's called a domestic violence monitoring notice, which is where you will, in addition to getting a protection order, get a notice that will be given to the police, so that if you are experiencing another act of domestic violence, you can immediately call the police. And in addition to that, the police should randomly come to your place and check that you're not being subjected to domestic violence. But since that has been implemented, and I think it was implemented two or 3 years ago now, I have never actually seen that being being implemented in practice. Not to say that it isn't, but none of the people that I've dealt with have ever had the protection of that notice. But over and above that, there's, in the legal system, I guess in particular, um, people come looking for protection from the courts. They get a temporary protection order, but their cases end up being postponed for more than a year, for example. So each time they come back to court for a final protection order, there's some postponement for any number of reasons. And things like that get in the way of, these laws that resulted as a result of the marches that happened in 2018 being effective. And like I said, I don't want to come off as a pessimist, but while those laws are important, they don't mean anything if they're not being implemented properly by the police, by the judiciary, and um, if they're not serving the people they're supposed to benefit, which are the survivors of domestic and gender-based violence.
Yeah, I think what I've heard is you saying there has to be a legal basis for it, but then you also have to have the capacity
Yeah,
to execute and
exactly.
act on it.
Exactly.
Very sobering. With that in mind, what is the role of the workplace, in your opinion?
What employers can do in a general sense is to capacitate their employees to empower themselves by making people aware of the fact that they have certain rights in terms of the different laws that exist. So platforms such as these, which educate people about the fact that domestic violence um, can constitute a crime, and then they can for that reason approach the police to report that crime. And over and above that, they can apply for protection orders in the domestic violence court. Are useful ways to start. But beyond that, employers must may rather um, assist their employees by providing support. Once a person leaves their partner, for example, it's always difficult for them to find places where they can find support. So employers can maybe create relationships with shelters, for example, where people who are leaving relationships, people who are affected by gender-based violence, can find support from, say, a shelter. They can stay there for a few days while maybe they look for somewhere to be, somewhere to move to, and that will depend possibly on the size of the employer, because some employers are more capable of doing that than others. Smaller employers, for example, if you happen to work at a bakery and there's maybe 10 employees, it's difficult for that employer to facilitate such a situation. What they can do, for example, is to maybe give them some leave days to allow them to relocate, to move to a relative's place or something to that effect. But for larger employers such as yourselves, you can of course establish relationships with shelters where if an employee needs to remove themselves from a situation, you can contact the shelter and say, we have an employee who's in distress currently and needs the support of a shelter. Can you please help them? And of course, like I said, allowing them certain leave days to be able to deal with and I guess recuperate if it's, for example, physical violence that's happened. Um, and obviously then recover. And the recovery is of course not just a physical thing but a psychological thing. So the efforts of wellness programs within employers are obviously a meaningful way to achieve that. So and it also is important, and I guess it's not just employers but employees within the structure must first of all be educated about gender-based and domestic violence, so that when a colleague happens to approach them, they are sensitive to the realities of what that person is going through. They are sensitive to the fact that domestic violence is a very personal thing, and for an employee to open up at all requires a huge sense of emotional strength, because it is a very vulnerable experience to go through, domestic and gender based. Exactly. So employees must be alive to the fact that their colleagues may want to speak to them rather than a person in a managerial position. So yeah, it's there are several different ways of doing it, but it starts with raising awareness, making sure that people are alive to the fact that the survivors of domestic violence and gender-based violence have different needs, and then allowing a situation where they can meet those needs.
Carlo, it's I could have a conversation with you for a long time. I just realized the time. So let me ask you this as a final conclusion, and I'd like you to complete the following sentence for me. A world free from gender-based violence is possible only if we all.
There are several things, and maybe it's because I'm a lawyer that I don't answer things directly. But if we all educate ourselves and others about the reality of gender-based violence, that would be a useful starting point. Beyond that, we need to, as a society, challenge I guess, the structural and societal norms that allow gender-based and domestic violence to continue and persist as it does. And I think um, we as men, in particular, and it ties into education and challenging societal structures. We as men have a responsibility, I think, to look at ourselves and hold ourselves accountable, not just for our own individual actions. It's very easy to say, I don't commit domestic or gender-based violence. But when you have friends, colleagues, relatives who are committing these acts, and you say nothing, that is obviously problematic. But we as men have a responsibility to take accountability, um, and collectively not just act as allies to women who are being subjected to gender-based violence, but beyond that, you know, bring down the societal patriarchal structures that allow this to continue. It's not a problem that any one individual or any small group of individuals can fix. It's a problem and challenge that everyone must take account for and deal with. It may start with something as basic as educating our children about our boy children about what constitutes domestic violence or gender-based violence and what not to do in a situation with a girl child, so that by the time they grow up, they understand that there's a responsibility on them not to contribute to this problem, which is essentially a national crisis.
Carlo, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I need to bring this conversation, I guess, to a conclusion. And perhaps the best way I can do this is to talk to our sense of purpose as an organization. We're a purpose-driven organization. We talk about wanting to make the world a better place by connecting people and improving lives. And I think this is my call out to everybody listening to this podcast today, is that journey starts with each one of us. You heard our guest talking about education. And my challenge to all of you is twofold. The first one is start the conversation. Growth and awareness starts with a conversation, and that educating yourself, as we heard. And also educate your children in terms of what is acceptable, but equally, what is not acceptable. An uncomfortable conversation, but a necessary conversation. And I know that I can call on every single one of you in our quest to make this world a better place. Let's also have these uncomfortable conversations for the greater good of this world we live in. Dakalo, thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. And ladies and gentlemen, until the next podcast, all the best. Take care.